Hello, my name is Carol White, and I am the President and Executive Director of the Corning Museum of Glass. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the 59th Annual Seminar on Glass, a program offered each year by the Corning Museum of Glass to welcome voices from many different communities to learn and share our knowledge and love of the art and history of glass. For the first time ever, due to the continued presence of the COVID-19 virus on our planet, we are meeting virtually. I would like to begin today's program by sharing the land acknowledgement that was developed for our current special exhibition, In Sparkling Company, Glass and the Cost of Social Life in Britain During the 1700s. It reads, "The land on which the Corning Museum of Glass sits is part of the historic and present territory of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. We acknowledge that 357 years ago, this ground was forcibly claimed by the British. In North America today, Canada and several Caribbean islands recognize Queen Elizabeth II as their official head of state. The legacy of British Empire is not so far away. The museum acknowledges the Haudenosaunee people, and we pay respect to their communities and elders, past and present. I am pleased to share that our community of seminarians who have registered for this year's program represents a wealth of geographic diversity, as our company includes 618 participants from 42 countries around the globe. I am thrilled that we have been able to reach such a broad group, and I'm looking forward greatly to the discussions and presentations that we will experience together over the next 2 days. It is no secret in the museum world that to execute an exhibition successfully takes a village of people from all backgrounds, but every exhibition begins with an individual idea. And in this case, with the idea generated by the museum's curator of early modern glass, Kit Maxwell. Although the show was delayed a year due to COVID, the team spent that time refining the design and interpretive content, resulting in an amazing, engaging, thoughtful, and provoking exhibition that has contributed to our knowledge of glass art, history, and science, that has revealed how glass was a critical element that shaped a century, and that helped me to understand the role glass played in the building of Britain's global empire. It is unlike any other exhibit this museum has put forth, and its narratives will live on in scholarship for years to come. My congratulations to all who have been engaged in the realization of this exhibition and its companion volume. And now it is my pleasure to turn the program over to your host for the next 2 days, Kit Maxwell.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Carol. Yes, I am Kit Maxwell. I'm curator of early modern glass, and it is indeed my pleasure to be hosting this 2-day event. It's really quite staggering to see the number of participants this event has attracted, and so incredibly gratifying. A team of us from across the organization has been meeting regularly since early summer, trying to envisage a new format, a virtual format for seminar. This, as Carol mentioned, is the first year we've been online. And none of us, of course, knew what the world would look like in October. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for your interest in our programming. And I hope that you find it as interesting as we are excited to present it to you. So just a reminder of the schedule. This is indeed a 2-day event, and today is day 1. And it will feature panel discussions, including museum colleagues and external collaborators who will be considering the approaches taken to interpretation, to digital media and design in our special exhibition in Sparkling Company, Glass and the Cost of Social Life in Britain during the 1700s. These 3 panels will be hosted respectively by Mika Fay, who is Manager of Education Interpretation, by Scott Sayre, Chief Information Officer, and by Caroline Fabian, who is Director of Collections and Curatorial Affairs. Tomorrow's session is titled Glass in the 18th Century Atlantic World, and it will feature 4 panel discussions that will be informed by the pre-recorded papers, links to which you should have already received. If you haven't watched them all, that's absolutely fine. Each panelist will be offering a brief recap of their research so that we can all follow along together. All sessions will be recorded, and you can use the link that you just used to log in today to come again tomorrow, and indeed log off and log on as many times as you like throughout the event. But do bear in mind that when you do log off, you'll lose the chat history. So if any links have been shared that you want to keep, take note of those before you leave us. There will be a question and answer session at the end of each panel. So please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, not the chat feature, but the Q&A, and that'll help us to harvest the questions more effectively. It seems from our registration notifications that we have a really broad and fairly equal spread of artists, of students, of museum professionals, of academics, and glass enthusiasts in our midst. So that is fantastic to have such a broad range of expertise. But please don't think that any question is too obvious to put into the Q&A. We want to be sure that everyone gets as much from these discussions as possible. And equally, do bear in mind that maybe your question is outside the wheelhouse of the respondent. So I hope we can join together and learn together collegially and with positive intent. So with so many time zones, we decided not to include an official break. However, each panel will be ending a little sooner than advertised to allow for 2 to 5 minutes pause, and you'll see a screensaver during this time. So just hang on if you don't intend to leave your computer, and we'll be right back. And to add a little variety, we also have a 30-minute hot glass demonstration on each of the days. And it's one of the great privileges, one of the unique privileges of being a curator at Corning, that I work alongside expert, specialist, renowned, very well-established glassmakers who are deeply engaged in the historic collection. And it's wonderful when we can collaborate together on projects like this. And so I look forward to sharing these demonstrations with you, which are very closely linked to the themes of seminar. Finally, the virtual world is wonderful at bringing us all together, but as I'm sure we've all learned over the course of the last 2 years, there is plenty of room for the unexpected. Should anything unforeseen occur from a technology point of view, please bear with us. We have a fantastic team of experts in our events department who they showed me just before we came on live. Three people working with 13 different screens in our event studio. It's truly remarkable. And they will be doing their very best to make sure everything is running smoothly again. But you'll be seeing quite a lot of me over the next 2 days. So I'm going to end my airtime right now and introduce in Sparkling Company, Glass and the Costs of Social Life in Britain during the 1700s through a pre-recorded tour of the exhibition gallery, which I hope will set the groundwork for the panel discussions that will follow. And at the end of this 30-minute tour, my colleague Mika Fay will emerge to moderate the first panel. So over to you, Scott, and events and the tour, please. Hello, I'm Kit Maxwell, and I'm curator of early modern glass here at the Corning Museum of Glass in New York. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to our special exhibition in Sparkling Company, Glass and the Costs of Social Life in Britain during the 1700s. The exhibition's aim is to use a lens of glass to show visitors what it meant to be modern in Britain during the 1700s and what it cost. So we begin the exhibition by acquainting visitors with the concept of social life in Britain in the 1700s, and we do that through Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens, which was an open-air event space in London where people of all classes could go, pay a modest entrance fee, enjoy dinner outside, watch fireworks, they could listen to the latest music, they could enjoy contemporary art installations, and they could get up to all sorts of other things in the bushes and shrubbery around. So this is the kind of introduction we want to give to visitors to help them feel comfortable with the concept of social life 250 odd years ago. And Vauxhall was famous throughout the 1700s for its illuminations, for its glass lanterns. There were thousands of them which hung from the trees, and they could all be lit within just a couple of minutes by virtue of a single fuse which linked them one to the other. And this fuse was dipped in flammable liquids, and at a certain point in the evening, people would emerge with lit tapers, they would touch the fuse, and all these lanterns would sparkle on, and it caused a sensation. People flocked to Vauxhall just to see the lanterns and spoke about them throughout Europe. Even Benjamin Franklin, visiting Vauxhall, wrote about the lanterns afterwards. And so we thought that introducing a contemporary twist to this would be rather fun. And so collaborating with the Brooklyn-based Fag Signs, we've installed a neon light, which I think suggests everything about the modernity that preoccupied people in Britain during the 1700s. It's glassy, it's eye-catching, it's urban, and it's a little bit seedy, so it fits really well into the theme of modernity. So just over my shoulder, you can see a vignette through one of Vauxhall's famous supper boxes into the exhibition itself. So let's follow the pink footsteps and head in. So we've introduced visitors to the concept of social life in Britain during the 1700s, but why is that relevant to visitors to a museum in Western New York in 2021? Well, we begin the exhibition with a map which identifies the British Empire throughout the 1700s, and on it identifies Corning being quite firmly within the realm of pink. And so we wanted to make it clear to visitors that the story of British glass in the 1700s is also a story of North America and British Empire and colonization. But the 1700s were also a really glassy age for Britain, and this is mainly due to the fact that in the late 1600s, they perfected a new recipe for glass production, including a high percentage of lead oxide. And this kind of glass became known ultimately as lead crystal. It contained about 30% or more lead oxide, which made it more refractive, clearer, brighter, stronger than glass had ever been before, and also heavy enough and strong enough to withstand transportation across the world. It was also, by virtue of the lead, soft enough for delicate cutting and engraving. And in the first case, we introduced the visitor to the difference between glass of the 1600s and the new lead crystal of the 1700s. And you can see what a great difference there was. In the 1700s, glass became central to new forms of sociability that arose in Britain's cities, which were rapidly becoming expanding hubs of politics, of trade, of commerce, of science, of fashion, and of culture. The exhibition has been designed by Seldorf architects and introduces their signature minimalist style, which carries forward this sense of modernity in the 1700s, which is a thread that we want to keep running throughout the exhibition. So we've established that lead glass was a modern material in Britain. It was part of the national manufacture, something of which the British were very proud. It was exported throughout the world. It enjoyed markets in the growing colonies in the British Empire. But the qualities, the material qualities of British lead glass were also used as a metaphor for ideals of polite behaviour. These were new rules of behaviour that emerged in the 1700s that enabled people from different backgrounds to synthesise, to live together in Britain's growing urban centres. Aristocrats and merchants, scientists and playwrights all cohabited and socialized together, and the rules of politeness demanded smooth, glossy, polished behavior. And the words polished and polite are used interchangeably in manuals of courtesy and civility throughout the 1700s. And to highlight the importance of the polished individual and glass as a metaphor for politeness, we have one of the many manuals that was published during this time that instructs readers on the very basic principles of standing, walking, giving or receiving something, dancing, and visitors can also scroll through an iPad and read each page and see the accompanying illustration. So being polished in the 1700s wasn't just about moving properly, but it was also about the polished appearance. And here mirrors play a key role. There have been great improvements in plate glass manufacture in Britain during the late 1600s. And so by the dawn of the 1700s, mirrors were part of most elite households. And they were no longer just small portable accessories that were carried around, but became more permanent fixtures. They could be placed on dressing tables, or they could be hung on walls or fixed into architectural paneling. And mirrors were extremely expensive. And we'll come on to that a bit later, but turning our attention to the dressing table set next to me, you can see one of probably the most iconic manifestations of plate glass of the 1700s. It's the toilette mirror. And the ritual of the toilette was established in France in the late 1600s and was adopted by the British aristocracy. And it was the semi-public preparation of the elite body where elite men and women were prepared for public view. And they were attended by their servants, their hairdressers. They were also attended by close friends and acquaintances, their chaplains, their dancing instructors, business associates. And it was quite a sociable affair, and a long one as well. And you can see on the table these two covered bowls, which would have contained some kind of nourishing broth to sustain the participants in this elite ritual. But the mirror was central to it and a real icon of glass in the 1700s. And just on the other side of the case, you can see a selection of prints on loan from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which depict both men and women at their toilette in this period. So the polished individual in the 1700s could also quite literally be covered in glass. And this court coat was made in France in the 1780s and is completely encrusted with glass jewels called paste, which sparkle like diamonds, or would have sparkled like diamonds as the wearer moved around in candlelight in particular. The buckles just beneath are also encrusted in glass paste jewels, as they were known. And the two swords that stand next to the coat have their hilts completely encrusted similarly in glass. And these swords were not practical, they didn't serve a particular function. They're kind of the ultimate in male jewellery in the 1700s and served to distinguish the social rank of the wearer. And there were certain courts in Europe where wearing a sword was mandatory for entrance. But the key to this kind of sparkling costume was that you had to have studied deportment. You had to know how to stand, to sit, to walk, to dance. Otherwise you would be bringing attention to your awkwardness under candlelight. So you're quite literally highlighting your elegance and your polished behaviour. I mentioned that this coat is French, and although Britain was at war with France for much of the 1700s, the British elite still flocked to Paris for the latest fashions. Paris was then, as it is now, a kind of mecca for the fashionable elite. And so it's quite reasonable to imagine that this coat made in France might have been worn by an English aristocrat. And in fact, we have reports of future George IV wearing glass-encrusted coats at court in London. And as well as paste jewels, we also have glass used as beads, and these sablé embroidered shoes were also made in France in the early 1700s. Then behind me we have a series of cases set into a mirrored wall, each one of which tells a distinct story. The first case is called Sparkling Accessories, and as the name suggests, it contains small-scale objects of personal adornment. We have earrings, we have a shawl clasp, we have smelling salt bottles. We also have a snuff box, which was made in response to the growing fashion for snorting powdered tobacco, known as snuff. Tobacco was grown in the British plantation colonies of Virginia and Maryland and was exported throughout Europe, and there was a great appetite for it in Asia as well, China in particular. On the far right of the case we have a string of beads. These were made in Venice and were purchased by European merchants for trade in Africa. The British excelled or overtook all other European nations in the so-called African trade by the late 1700s. And these beads would have been exchanged there for ivory, for gold, and then increasingly for slaves, who were then trafficked across the Atlantic to the British plantations in North America and the West Indies. The British trafficked more than 3 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic during the 1700s, and the economies of slavery really were the underpinning of British society during this period. The next case is titled Glass and Polite Science, and it charts the progress of lenses into the world of fashion and sociability.
Science had become a polite pastime by the early 1700s. Gentlemen attended societies that discussed the latest scientific advancements. Books were published in English, not Latin or Greek, that taught men, women and children the basic principles of optics and how to use their own scientific instruments. So we have here one such book with some reading glasses, some spectacles. We have a microscope, a tabletop telescope, and then at the end, two curious objects known as polemoscopes. And these were in fact developed initially for use in the military. They enabled the viewer to point the instrument directly ahead as if you're using a telescope, but through a clever arrangement of mirrors inside, actually enabled the viewer to look around corners. They didn't prove particularly useful in the military, but were a great success in social life, where they could be taken to the opera and viewers could appear to be watching what was going on stage, but in fact be spying on their neighbours to the left and to the right. Trade with China was a huge part of the British economy and a huge part of British culture, in fact, during the 1700s. The British began trading directly with China at the very beginning of the century, and the volume of trade increased exponentially as the decades rolled on. At the back of this case, you can see a reverse painted picture depicting the European warehouses at the harbour of Canton, just up along the Pearl River in China. This was the only place that European or foreign merchants were allowed to do business in China during the second half of the 1700s. The Chinese very closely controlled access to the Chinese mainland. The picture itself is reverse painted onto glass, so that is, a sheet of glass is decorated from behind. The technique itself goes back to antiquity and was introduced to China by European merchants in the late 1600s. The Chinese had a long tradition of graphic art, porcelain painting and ink painting, and they really took to this decorative technique on glass to such an extent that their work was much admired back in Europe. However, they didn't have the plate glass technology to produce the glass for this, so the glass that you see in this frame was probably produced in England, shipped to China, where it was painted by the Chinese artists before being returned to England again, and a journey that could have taken up to 2 years. The major export, however, from China was tea. The British had a great appetite, still have a great appetite for tea, and it was available in many different qualities and grades. The British East India Company, which controlled the trade with, which represented British trading interests in China, would auction off this tea back in London. And those who bought the most expensive quite naturally wanted to show it to advantage. And lead glass was an ideal vehicle for this. It was airtight and it could show the quality of the tea within. The tea, however, would have been carefully locked away by the lady of the house. It was something that was entirely within her control, and tea was dished out or mixed, put into teapots in front of her guests. It was a ritual that was enjoyed very much in elite circles. However, the Chinese really wanted to be paid for their tea in silver, and this didn't really sit well with the British. At that time, the British occupied much of India, increasing swaths of India, and so they began to grow opium in Bengal, which they smuggled illegally into China and stimulated an opium addiction. And this drove the Chinese to pay for the illegally imported opium with silver, which the British could then use to purchase tea. And that is why we include in this case a fitting for an opium pipe made in the very early 1800s, when the opium trade was at its most nefarious, and it's decorated with carved glass jewels. At the front of the case, we have a maritime telescope which reminds us that it was indeed glass that enabled these ships to navigate the world. It was glass that was used in telescopes, glass lenses that were used in lighthouses, also glass that was used in thermometers and barometers and other navigational instruments. As well as the economic connection to China, we also consider the impact of China on British design and British cultural life. The Europeans during the 1700s were rather preoccupied with examining their own origins in classical antiquity in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. But China was also an ancient civilization that was much admired in Europe for its history, for its sophisticated philosophy, for its revered court system, for its decorative arts which were in high demand back in Europe, porcelain in particular, but also lacquer and silks. And so Chinese design impacted European design quite significantly and offered European consumers an alternative way of expressing themselves aesthetically. So in this case, we have examples of glass that are inspired by Chinese porcelain. They're opaque and white. The two vases also respond to the shapes of imported Chinese porcelain vases and are decorated in a style and a palette that you would often see on imported Asian porcelain. We have another example of a reverse painted picture. This one is part mirror and part painting, and is really quite interactive because it enabled viewers at the time to imagine themselves within the Chinese landscape. And to kind of give this sense of interactivity, we've reproduced the frame of this mirror and put it around the outside of the case. So you're looking at plate glass through plate glass with a similar frame, a kind of Alice in Wonderland effect, but I think it gives a sense of how interactive these things were originally. We also have a selection of engraved lead glass goblets, again demonstrating how receptive this new English lead crystal was to delicate, sophisticated decoration. And we've used the engraving running around the larger goblet to inspire the damask pattern that we've reproduced graphically around the base of the dressing table that displays the toilette service, and also the dessert table that we have elsewhere in the exhibition. British society was then, as now, a divided society. In the first half of the 1700s, the divide lay between those who supported the Protestant Hanoverian succession and those who supported the exiled Catholic Stuarts, who wanted to reclaim the throne and turn Britain into a Catholic nation. These two lead glasses again demonstrate the receptiveness of the material to the political moment. On the left we have a glass engraved with the arms of Queen Anne, the Protestant ruler of 1707, it's dated, and on the right we have a glass engraved in support of her exiled half-brother and his descendants, who are then living on the continent, wanting to return to England and recapture the throne. The next case gives some context to two glass medallions that we have in our collection. The one on the left represents William Wilberforce, a politician, and the one on the right, Hannah More, who was a writer and an evangelist, a notable evangelist. And both campaigned for the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, which was finally achieved in 1833. These are not names that are necessarily familiar to people today, but they were certainly familiar enough in the early 1800s when these cameos were made for their likenesses to be reproduced and those in support of the abolitionist movement to collect them and to treasure them. So to add some context to the abolitionist movement, we have in the back borrowed a logbook from a slave ship from the National Maritime Museum in London, which was written and illustrated by the captain of a slave ship during his voyage to Africa in the 1790s. And we see on this page an illustration of a slave market in West Africa that he encountered during this voyage. The last wall case addresses British North America, and on the left we have two volumes that contain the published letters of Ignatius Sancho, who was a formerly enslaved African living in London among the elite during the late 1700s. He was patronized by various members of the nobility and members of society and corresponded with them regularly. And following his death in 1782, his letters were published in order to raise funds to support his widow. In this instance, we have the book open on a letter that reports the siege of Charleston in 1780. It was an occasion of great optimism for British patriots who thought that the colonies, the North American colonies, had been recaptured and everything would thereafter be well again. Obviously that wasn't the case, but the lead glass on the right shows us again how receptive these drinking vessels were to the political moment. The small one is engraved with a toast in support of the friends of His Majesty's American loyalists who were in favour of British rule in North America. And the one on the right is engraved with the coat of arms of the Hudson's Bay Company, which controlled the highly lucrative fur trade in North America. Britain had taken Canada from France in 1763, and it remained a British colony right until into the 19th century. And in fact, it's still the reason why Canada recognises Queen Elizabeth II as their head of state to this day. So although Britain lost the 13 colonies, it still retained a presence in America, in Canada, and also in Central America and the West Indies. In the 1720s, diamonds were discovered in Brazil, which at that time was a part of the Portuguese Empire. But diamonds came onto the market in London in significant quantities, and London became a European centre for the rough diamond trade. And it's at about this moment that we see the emergence of cut lead glass. And in many instances, you can see how closely the cutting of the lead glass resembles that of diamonds, the rose cut in particular. You can see in the large circular pendants at the bottom. And these would have sparkled brilliantly, just like diamonds would have done in candlelight. And so you see a close connection between the prestige of diamonds and also the prestige of British lead crystal. Mary Little, painted by Thomas Gainsborough, is one of the great highlights of the exhibition on loan to us from the Yale Centre for British Art. And Mary Little is here really to represent the elite 5% who would have owned the sorts of objects that are on display here. It's tempting to think when you walk into a museum that everybody in the past lived with the objects that are on view, but the reality was really far from that. Mary Little, however, wasn't from the aristocracy. Her family's fortune was based on the textile industry, which boomed in Britain during the 1700s. Raw silk came from China and cotton came from North America. It was processed along with British wool in England and then re-exported throughout the British Empire and along its trade routes, which were then circling the globe. But notice also the glass ornament in Mary Little's hair, the aigrette, as it was called. Next to Mary Little, we have a deed of sale for a 16-year-old girl named Jeannie, who was sold in the 1780s by her enslaver, a former British colonist in Connecticut, for the sum of £35 with all her wearing apparel. And £35 was about half the annual salary of a school teacher in Virginia at this time. And this reminds us of the close connection between people like Mary Little, whose wealth depended upon the exportation of textiles around the world, and the realities of British Empire and colonization, and the enduring impact that this left on North America after independence. This dessert table incorporates a large portion of the museum's collection of 18th century British glass, namely cut tableware designed for the dessert. And the dessert became a staple of elite dining in the 1700s, thanks to the increasing availability of sugar in Britain. Sugar was produced on the Caribbean islands, particularly Jamaica, which became the most profitable of Britain's North American colonies during this period. And on this island, the enslaved population outnumbered the enslavers by 10 to 1. The types of objects you see on this table were designs that were mainly new in the 1700s. They simply wouldn't have existed without this appetite for sugar and the availability of sugar on the British market. And our hot glass team have spent some time searching through 18th century recipe books, trying to understand the kinds of confectionery, the kinds of sweetmeats that would have been contained in the various vessels we have in our collection. So these iPads show visitors both the types of objects that are on the table and explain the different designs and forms, and also reveal the recipes for the different sweetmeats and identify the different types of confectionery that have been recreated. This goblet is another great highlight of the exhibition on loan to us from the Beacon Museum in Whitehaven, the UK. It's part of a small group of goblets that we can identify as being decorated by the enameller, the glass enameller, William Bealby, most famous enameller of the period. This small group is characterized by bearing the royal coat of arms on one side. The other side of this goblet is decorated with a toast to the success of the African trade of Whitehaven. And Whitehaven is a harbour town in the north of England, and during the 1700s it was closely connected, closely involved in the so-called African trade. This goblet was decorated in 1763, which was in fact the busiest year for Whitehaven's African trade. Some 9 ships left its harbour, destined for Africa on slaving missions. Here we have a garniture or a group of vases which again is inspired by Chinese forms but decorated with very European motifs. These are clearly not colourless lead crystal, but they are coloured green by the addition of copper oxide, which makes them an ideal background for gilded decoration. And these pastoral rural figures would have been put on a mantelpiece set above a crackling fire with possibly candles on either side, and would have sparkled and almost danced in the candlelight, and quite dynamic and animated. These vases were probably produced in London, decorated at the workshop of somebody called James Giles. They were therefore probably intended for an urban consumer, maybe somebody who wasn't connected to the countryside through landed estates, maybe a merchant, a financier, a banker. It's interesting to observe the changing relationship between the elite and ideals of country living during the 1700s, which are closely interwoven with the ideals of nature embodied in the Enlightenment and the discourse of philosophy around Enlightenment at the time. We have here some various examples of plate glass. I mentioned that plate glass production was greatly enhanced by improvements in technology in the late early 1700s in Britain, and that enabled mirrors and plates of glass to be produced larger than ever before. Mirrors were hung on walls, set into panelling. Plate glass could be used also to make windows that were larger and clearer than ever before. So plate glass really transformed the architectural environment and also the domestic interior. A mirror plate of this size might have cost around £100. And to put that into context, a middle-class family in Britain had a total income of around £200 that might have supported 5 family members and 2 servants. And from that £200, they would have had an estimated annual discretionary spending of about £16 which really puts into context the cost of this kind of mirror at around £100 before you even add the carved gilded frame. The plate glass that was required for these pole screens, which would have sat in front of a fire protecting people's pale complexions and makeup from the warm glow of the flames, also required very high quality plate glass, because if you were to paint or stain or decorate glass that was warped or had air bubbles or was anyway crooked, the picture would have been entirely distorted and ruined. So these painted scenes were necessarily applied to the very finest quality plate glass. The Duke and Duchess of Northumberland were among Britain's most glamorous aristocrats, and in the early 1770s they commissioned the leading architect Robert Adam to design for them a glass-panelled drawing room for their London home, Northumberland House. This drawing room or reception room was panelled entirely between chair rail and ceiling with plates of red varnished reverse spangled glass interspersed with pairs of green reverse spangled glass pilasters, and in among them all were set enormous looking glasses imported from the French royal factory of Saint-Gobain, which at that time could produce the largest looking glasses, the largest and finest looking glasses or mirrors in Europe. The cost of these imported looking glasses was over £1,400, to which was added a 75% import tax, which again really stands in stark contrast to the £16 discretionary spending enjoyed by members of Britain's middling classes. The room was demolished in 1874 and the panels were packed up and eventually found their way to the Victoria and Albert Museum. Some can be seen on display in London, but also in the Victoria and Albert Museum in Dundee. And over the last few years, we've been collaborating with the V&A to remove the rest from storage and have them conserved and brought to Corning especially for this exhibition, where we are thrilled to reunite them or unite them for the first time with the architect's original design drawings, which are on loan to us from Sir John Soane's Museum, also in London. These are, as I say, the original design drawings from the 1770s, which give a sense of the architect's original scheme or ideas for the interior. So in addition to the panels and to the design drawings, we've spent the last few years collaborating with a digital experience company in Dublin, NoHo, to recreate this lost drawing room in virtual reality. We closely studied the panels at the Victoria and Albert Museum, along with Adam's original design drawings. We also looked at photographs of the room before it was demolished in the 1870s. And as a result, we have been able to recreate this lost interior in virtual reality. We were also able to access the surviving furniture, which happily still exists and is still in the collection of the Duke of Northumberland at Syon House, along with the chimney piece. So we really could completely furnish the room, more or less as it would have been in the 1770s. Most remarkably of all, though, is that we can transition from daylight to nighttime and enjoy the room in its full reflectivity in varying degrees of light and candlelight and moonlight. Well, thank you for joining me. That was just a taste of In Sparkling Company, Glass and the Costs of Social Life in Britain during the 1700s, which is up on display here at the Corning Museum of Glass in New York until January 2nd, 2022. We hope to see you here.